let's start. And as always, oh, I have the wrong game lined up, of course, but that's easy to change. As always, what you see in the right-hand side of your screen are the notes that were done by the player. And I always put these notes in there because A, I don't always read them off, and B, I want you to gain a sense of what valuable notes are. We've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of people have gotten much better at doing notes, and it is a skill to do notes, and once that skill will definitely help you in your own chess, mostly because it will force you to put words on the subconscious concepts that are actually guiding your thinking in the game. Okay, so here we go, and we're going to flip the board because Julio is black here. In fact, let's change this up here. Let's say black is Julio here, and he's better than 1600, so we're just going to put in Julio. All right. So one of the fascinating things about this game is Julio is going to channel Kostya and a system that Kostya put forward. Now I'm going to guess Kostya would rather Julio play d6 here. That is the normal way. But it should be stressed that if white plays e5 here, it's not actually the end of the world. And I actually had this once with against Soviet Grandmaster Gutman ages ago, and I just knew that e5 was good, but I didn't really understand the position, and black plays d6 next, and he's mostly fine. Maybe white has a small advantage. Anyways, that is not the subject of our discussion today. It is the same-ish, and this very interesting system that Kostya puts forward now with a6. And where it gets incredibly interesting and spicy is Kostya wants now black to play b5, kind of Benko Gambit style. Okay, so I want to claim this. I'm not a King's Indian expert. I'm a King's Indian fan, but I'm not a King's Indian expert. I want to claim that the precursor to this immediate b5 is c6 first, followed by b5, just in terms of how the idea developed, if you will. And c6 isn't, it might look really weird, but it's not completely ridiculous. You're dominating the knight on c3, and you're getting the queen out. So in any case, then the question simply becomes, well, can or should white take this pawn? And, you know, Julio claims he's 1600. Honestly, he plays much better than that in this game, but he's playing somebody who's much higher rated. And definitely this is a selling point for Kostya and his videos on openings, where I think the value of a good opening is not something where you sit and learn 1,000 lines and you stay up late at night, but just some basic system where somebody explains to you, like, all right, this is what's going on. Now, the difficulty and the interesting part for me is coming up, the decisions that black's going to have to make. And white, there's going to be a lot of them coming forward. Now, I want to say here that I can imagine that c takes b5 is the most principled move here for white, and I think Julio gives this variation here with c6 now, though I'm sure black could do other things. And I just want to say, as white, I would feel real nervous about this. Like, maybe I would convince myself to do it just because it's the principled thing to do, and what else am I supposed to do? But it would be very hard for me to accept that pawn whilst the king is on e1. Now, by the way, we got to say, with this whole thing that white is doing, one of the things I want to stress is, obviously, white is down in time, in development, because he's done moves like f3 and knight e2, 4 pawn moves, and knight e2, he's going to have to move the knight again someday. And what it's about, of course, is it's about a claim that white is making of space. And so this loss in time has to be compensated by the more abstract spatial gains that white is going to try to maintain throughout the game. And I think that's one of the key things that black should say in the notes, just being like, oh, you know, I'm fighting for some kind of quick compensation against the space before I get squeezed to death. And one of the reasons I mention that now is I think b5 in the Benko is very much about distracting white from the center and then later the king side, getting enough play over there. It's not necessarily even that you're going to win on the queen side, but just create enough drama there that white doesn't burn you, squeeze you to death. And we're going to get a Benko-like question right away after knight c1, namely, this happens in the Benko too. What is the purpose of b5? Is it to take on c4, or is it to play b4? Now, let me just frame it, if you will, with the Benko, and say this position. It is totally acceptable for white to play a passing move like knight f3 or queen c2. They sometimes transpose. And what's interesting is most Benko players will just play g6, right? And they're saying if cb will play a6, you know, we can keep that in reserve. And the interesting thing is, I think the cue for us to play b4 would be if white plays knight c3. So the b pawn then functions as a way to kick the white knight away from its central control. bc is of course possible, and we're going to see that in the game. But it's my first big decision here. When I say mine, I just mean as somebody who is observing this game. Well, what should black do in this position? Now, he could play knight d7. As mentioned, he could play something like c6. He could play takes, as in the game, and he could push. Personally, I think he should push. That's my sense. The knight, I don't want the knight on c3. Let's push him away from the center. And let's also say, and this is going to be a theme of the game, white has more space, but he's got some funky pieces, and the knight on c1 is part of that funk. I'm sure white had studied deeply the same-ish stuff and had seen that a bunch of strong GMs have played knight c1 in similar positions, and it was funky in those games too, right? One of the things you've heard me say on the show before, it is one of the hardest aspects of chess, and in particular modern chess, to play with the space advantage. I say especially with modern chess because the computer loves the space advantage. You give it almost any position with a space advantage and it's just going to love it, which is why King's Indian in general, the computer hates it. But that doesn't mean, the King's Indian's toast. It just means that A, white players would need to understand how to play like the computer, and B, is the computer actually overvaluing the space advantage that white gets. Okay, so big decision. I thought b4 was the cleanest here. So, takes. Now, the controversy about taking is that we have developed the bishop, and then we have to ask, is the bishop useful on c4? Is the bishop useful on c4? And that's going to be one of our big questions going forward. So, knight d7, castles, and c5. And this is the fact that black can play c5 like this is an example of why a6 b5 is more efficient than playing c6 and b5 a little slower, right? Okay, so fascinating position. I spend a lot of time on these positions, and I showed them to some students of mine, and I think this is a good instructive position for white. What should white do? Now, he plays d5, And I feel like that's probably the natural instinct of a Samish player, right? Probably he had seen lines like that. But I got a lot of problems with d5. First is you lost the tempo. Second is, because it's a pawn move, pawns aren't people. Second is you blocked your bishop on c4. And, now we're going to get this interesting structure. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So just in terms of a gut instinct, I want to get this knight in immediately. So I think white should take this thing, and then whether black takes back with the knight or the pawn to bring the knight out. After which, maybe white's a little bit better. I don't have any strong convictions on that, but I would like that much better for white than what we get in the game. Okay, now like I said, a lot of interesting moments in this game. Here we are to another one. How should black play? While you're thinking of that, I'll tell a little story. I got this new chess coach. I call him KGB because he's an old Soviet dude. And one of the things he's just been yelling at me nonstop about, just nonstop, is that I'll get a position like this in an actual game, and I'll just think about it forever, man. And he forces me, I was writing down the time of my moves anyway, but he's really on me about situations where I'm tanking. And, for us analyzing now, it's absolutely appropriate for us to spend forever thinking about the different plans black has at his disposal, because that will kind of give us a vocabulary for plans when we're actually playing. But the Soviet is really clear that, hey, buddy, hey, this was ultimately going to be an intuitive decision, and I don't want you thinking forever on the intuitive decisions, because you're going to need time later when we actually have to calculate. And that's when I want you to spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes, when you have some very difficult position. Okay, so first I'm going to tell you what I think the Soviets' move would be. I think the Soviet would look at this and say, you know what? I'm just going to play rook b8. And why? Because I have no idea what white's going to do. Knight b3, queen e2, queen c2, queen d2. I got no idea what the guy's going to do, but I know that rook b8 can't be wrong. So white is going to have a difficult decision in front of him. I don't know. If I was white, I don't know which of those moves I would pick. And then we'll figure it out. And the other plans we have coming up next for black are knight b6, knight e5, queen somewhere. We got all kinds of things going on. And what white does will give us some information. Okay, I wanted us to think about d5, this structure, for a second, just to give you a point of comparison. Let's go back to this normal Benko. Let's call it normal anyway. And imagine snip, snop, and pop. This is a variation I think is still popular, but when I was a kid it was kind of invented, and it seems really weird. But I just want to give you a comparison. Now, there's a variety of things black can do, but I just want to show the general idea. Namely, we're going to get a structure very similar to the game. I'm sure there's other moves besides knight d2. I think a4 is a big move for white, for example. But the thing I wanted to stress is this, I think, is a much more favorable version of the structure than white gets in the game, right? And one of the things I want to also say about this is that part of the interesting drama, we're going to get this in the game too, is if black ever plays a5, then there's a big hole on b5, right? So that's a way for white to play. And one of the beauties about this move b6, just tossing the pawn, is to say, I'm not interested, black, in your pawns. I'm not interested in your pawns, buddy. I'm interested in squeezing the life out of you, in particular with restricting your minor pieces. All right, let's go back to the game. So that's why d5 feels wrong to me. Now, black's next move, I think, can't be wrong. It cannot be wrong, but the follow-up, I think, is debatable. or is harder to find. And so he plays knight e5. We're going to talk about it. Another plan that you could do also after rook b8 if you decided to would be knight b6 and e6. And in general, for the Benko players I coach, I don't want them to make this move, but the rationale for busting up your center a little bit like this is very simple, that white's knight is stupid, and we're going to try to bust the game open before white is properly coordinated. You know, it's funny with e6 too, because we're going to see e6 in a position that later I'm a little bit more suspicious of. And just for the Benko players, let's just admire this structure, you know. What a beautiful structure. Now, of course, we don't want to play knight b6 unless we're going to play e6. So let's stick with black's intuition. Knight e5, bishop e2. Sorry, I have a little cough today. And here's where a difficult moment for black about what to do. Let's state some obvious things. Oh, by the way, another plan that wasn't mentioned, a very typical Benko plan, would be knight e8, c7, intending knight b5, something like that. In any case, let's do this. And white is not yet threatening f4, should be said, because of knight eg4. But if you get frisky with a move like e6, then you're going to get hit with f4. So there's all kinds of permutations where f4 is going to get hit, going to work. So if I play knight e8, I'm going to get hit with f4. Okay. Now I want to say with f4, it's not necessarily about crushing your king or anything immediate like that. It's mostly about making your pieces terrible. And that is what the space advantage is about. And that's why it's so hard. It's hard to keep mentally your opponent's pieces corralled. Let's say something else obvious. The knight on c1 is terrible, but it does not want to play knight d3. It does not, because that would trade off a minor, and that's in the Benko. That is the dream. In the Benoni, that is the dream. You want to trade some minors off to alleviate the spatial disadvantage that you're suffering under. Okay, so I think rook b8 would be a good move. And there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on here for black. Once you commit to knight e5, you got to tell yourself this is a very dynamic decision that you've made. And you are going to have to get ready for some fancy footwork, you know. Like if bishop d7, then you got to worry about h3 with a firm f4 coming up because you don't have this retreat square. Okay, so here it gets a poor move, black's first poor move of the game, a5, and he correctly says that white should have immediately pounced on it with a4. And I think maybe just stare at it for a second. This comes up in that other Benko line that I was talking about earlier. There will be a grip, a full-on grip of the light squares on the queen side. And the main effect of that will be that black won't have any play on that side of the board. And then after we squish that play on the queen side, we can then do the inevitable f4s and maybe even g4, g5s of this fine world. Okay. What is the rating of these guys? Well, Julio claims he's only 1,600, but I think he's stronger, much stronger, and the other guy's 2,200, and this is an over-the-board game. So, knight b5, question mark, a4, exclam, absolutely. Now we're in business. Now we're in full business because the b5 square cannot be held anymore, and you have just developed your rook on a8. Rook b1. Now, his opponent criticized queen b6, and it's certainly true, I think, that a move like bishop d7 is more natural. But let's give it a break. It's okay. It's got to be okay. The guy plays b3. Okay. Bishop d7. Fine. And here's where I feel like maybe some familiarity with the Benko positions would be good. I think you should just take on b3, you know? and let's give your business here, and you give queen b4, maybe. Well, you're right. Just at the very least, let's just say you make a move like queen c7. I love your position, man. I love it. You could do other things too, but the general Benko rule is, once you've got a weakness on the queen side, and here, by the way, you're not even down a pawn. Once you have a weakness on the queen side, then you will have enough play to generate the business against that weakness, right? Now, granted, here, it's a little hot because I think white's going to want to play h3, and it's going to get a little hot. But let me tell you, if you didn't want it to be hot, you shouldn't have been playing this opening, man. You shouldn't have been playing this opening if you didn't want it to get hot. Yeah. Okay, more could be said about this, but I just think the main thing is I felt like you made it a little complicated for yourself here. Queen c2, a3. I still like your position, but now you don't have the open lines on the queen side. Knight d1, you write, I wasn't expecting this one. I wasn't expecting it either. I wasn't expecting it either. That looks totally weird. And you write that h3 should be critical. I totally agree. Let's focus on his move and your position. What should you do? Here I feel like you're doing great. And we should say that a lot of times when a player is trying to squeeze you with space, in order to take advantage, to not take advantage of your minor pieces, which he wants to dominate, he'll do crazy things like move his own minors way out of the way so that they don't get traded off. And that's what we're seeing here. And obviously it's controversial. Who knows how this is going to go? This might not end well. Okay. So I think, yeah, like I said, I think you're doing great. And I see two moves that I like. Personally, I like this move, rook fc8, intending c4. Just feel like you're going to crush the guy. And I showed this to a student of mine, and he came up with rook fb8, also intending c4. I like mine a little bit better because I want to get some juice on the queen on c2. But this one I analyzed with him too, and it just seemed very, very nice. One thing is funny, I started talking about the juice, and maybe that's from this new word, the juicer. I don't know. But I don't know. I don't actually understand how to correctly use the word juicer in a sentence, but the juice, I do understand the juice. Okay, so in this position, black plays e6 and writes finally. So I feel like that's where, this is where the game starts, in my mind, this is where the game starts turning a little bit. Namely, in this position, you have no structural problems. You're not even down a pawn. Like, let's say we take away the a3 pawn. Let's just lift it off the board. Do I like black? Yeah, you've got a great Benko position. You've got a great Benko position. And here, this a3 pawn, well, it can still become a bit of a monster. There's possibilities, they're not too hard to imagine, where you start taking stuff on b3 and then a big party gets started. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I think me and the student came up with the following variation. Rook fc8, h3, c4, f4, cb, queen takes, and now pawn takes. Why pawn takes? Because otherwise my knight's going to land there, and then everything will just be joy and Brahms and the whole thing. So a takes, and now in this interesting position, I believe we came up with knight e4. Wait, let me make sure. Actually, it was very intense. It was very intense here. I better get it right. It was like a2, rook a1, rook c1, bishop c1, knight e4, fe, bishop e5, bishop knight here, and I think this was winning. I think it was at least a good deal. In any case, I'm getting a little bit astray. A little bit astray. In any case, right, so e6, I think this is what he wants. And what one of the problems may be is that, for one, you're not threatening d5. I think it would be a much nicer situation for you if you were threatening d5. Note to Benny, 28 minutes for me, 32 for him. Now, normally, a month ago, I would have said, hey, buddy, that's fine, Julio. That's fine. The KGB, he'd be on us here, because you've already spent so much time thinking about these. A lot of those decisions were intuitive. Now, were they interesting for us to talk about afterwards? Yes, and this is the appropriate time to talk about it. But during the game, the intuitive decisions have to come immediately. And a lot of the blunders that are going to happen have everything to do with you only having 28 minutes now. Okay, now it is appropriate for white to trade, because now his advantage is structural. It's not just space. Knight d7. Now, maybe you should have played rook a8. I didn't like an f4. F4 is a frisky move. I think the guy should just be moving like knight f2. Frisky. And here I don't like this move. Julio, I don't like this move, buddy. Another structural weakness I don't think you need. And I was thinking about it. I was like, well, how come dude can't just go like this? Boom. And then if f5, boom, boom, boom. Isn't that good? Isn't that okay for us? Now, maybe it's frightening after f6, but honestly, he's just not ready for us. Not ready. So f5 was like, I don't know. And then this is where you made me cry, Julio. You played here. Actually, that wasn't the move. It was this. That wasn't the move. It was that move. That was the move that made me cry. Up until here, you've played a really nice game. But this is the screamer here, because now the knight gets activated, and you've got some grief. As you pointed out, knight d6 also. The whole structure is much worse for you. And the bad king, especially in time pressure, it's not a friend of ours. It's not a friend. And then I assume he's winning after knight f3. Yeah. Because bishop's got to move, which it doesn't. And we lost it. And bishop moves, and we lose the pawn on d5. So Julio, I thought that was a very interesting game. Lots of interesting King's Indian decisions. Kostya had his own game in Vegas, and I covered it. I was doing it live here. We were doing some live commentary, and I want to talk about that game too. A lot of times in these close positions, you can get some very interesting positional decisions to make. Kostya says he wants to cover that himself. I might still do it. Kostya, if you're listening, buddy, I still might cover that game. All right,